Hi, everyone. A while back, I was reading an award-winning Army War College paper from my good friend, Colonel Tom Rendall, who is also my co-author for our latest novel, The Fifth Column. I asked Tom if I could use one of his lead stories that he researched for that paper, and he graciously agreed. It's an absolutely true story. It's a meaningful one, and I think you'll agree that it changed history in more than just one way. It's a story about a four-star general and a young mid-grade officer. The four-star commanding general was known for his Missouri toughness. He was known for being cold and hard-bitten and oftentimes unreasonable. It was often said that he could read right through a man, through his boots and through his buttons. And on this particular day, the four-star general had gotten out of his vehicle, and he was followed by all of his entourage, members of his staff, and he walked over to this training site to view this American division's training that was in progress. It was a great opportunity to demonstrate the preparedness of his massive force to the president of the country that they were responsible for defending. But there was little advance warning of the visit, so folks were scrambling hard just to prepare. When he got there, the four-star general didn't like what he saw. He was completely unimpressed with the training and with the critiques and the explanations that were offered by the two-star division commander and his chief of staff. So the four-star general just started to publicly chastise the two-star and the assembled staff members. And for many of us, as we know, that's just usually the way that it works, right? But as the division commander and his staff stood by, completely silent and not just a little bit intimidated, the four-star general turned to leave, but there was this very insistent voice of a lone captain who had just been minted a temporary lieutenant colonel, and he stopped him. "General," he shouted. The officer stepped forward. He began to talk calmly and deliberately, but also insistently explaining the problems of the training thus far, and that he alone was responsible for the training, and he should be the one to answer the four stars questions. The officer also stated that, quite candidly, he should know that the four stars headquarters was part of their problem. The four-star turned again to leave, but the officer reached out to hold his elbow just to stop him so that he could finish. And he continued to address him. And at the conclusion of the young officer's somewhat forced briefing, the four-star's lips tightened, and then he departed without another word. Sometime later on, he sent a note to the division asking for the young officer to be assigned to his staff, and he did join the four stars staff, and he rose to the rank of colonel, and then he became the field army's director of operations and training, their G3, by the end of the war. The setting for that exchange was France, and the four-star general was none other than General John J. Blackjack Pershing. The young officer, that lieutenant colonel, the temporary lieutenant colonel, was George C. Marshall. And while they were operating at vastly different levels, they were preparing elements of the American Expeditionary Force to enter into World War I. So another quick story. Some years later, the President of the United States was meeting with his Secretary of Treasury and another advisor at the White House to discuss the deteriorating world situation. The advisors presented a plan for a massive expansion of the size of the U.S. Armed Forces and a huge increase in the defense budget. And the president was described as being flippant and somewhat cynical and disapproved their recommendation. After all, the country wasn't at war, and a plan like that would just complicate an already dangerous situation. And oh, by the way, it was an election year, and so mobilization would have sent warlike signals that they didn't need at that time. So it was politically very sensitive. It would disturb the American people and leaders of other nations, whether they were friendly to the United States or not. So in desperation, the Secretary of the Treasury asked the president to hear out the other man who was with him, this advisor whose face by this time had flushed this brick red. The other advisor was standing by, and he walked over to the president's chair, and he asked for 3 minutes to explain the need for the program. And in those 3 minutes, the course of history just completely changed. 2 days later, the president sent this new program with an even bigger budget increase to Congress, and it passed. The president was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the advisor was General George C. Marshall, the same Marshall who had addressed General Pershing in France so many years before, when Marshall was a captain, that temporary lieutenant colonel that I was telling you about. So those are two stories. I think you can see the connection between them, though, because without the first story, where a subordinate can state his or her honest opinions on really important matters without being chastised or denigrated or punished for doing so, the second story never would have been possible. In other words, if Lieutenant Colonel Marshall knew the facts and couldn't communicate them to General Pershing, then it's entirely probable that 22 years later, General Marshall would have failed to communicate all the necessary facts and provide his best military advice to President Roosevelt. He would fail either because he was conditioned to bear the general's critique silently, or because his own resoluteness and his own insistent response would have caused him to be relieved from duty, fired, preventing his promotion altogether. So what's the lesson here? My belief is that leadership done well isn't proud, it's open, it encourages leadership at all levels, because we're all leaders, but the best leaders, like George Marshall, lead through their own example. So that's it. I thought you'd like to know.